6 engines, but they did not ignite at the same instant, only a few thousandths of a second apart. At a glance, it seems harmless, but that may be precisely the answer to a mystery that has remained unresolved for months now. Why did Flight 12 flip in the wrong direction? The latest data from Ship 40 is pointing directly at that answer, and if that is indeed the case, another question immediately arises. Could Flight 13 be carrying that very same risk? Let us dissect every detail. All right then, so what actually happened within those few thousandths of a second? June 30th, Ship 40 was rolled out to the test stand at the Massey's site at Starbase. 6 Raptor engines were simultaneously activated for a static fire test. At normal playback speed, you would see exactly one thing: fire. A great deal of fire. Extremely impressive. This is, by its very nature, the kind of footage that anyone following Starbase loves watching over and over again, purely for its sheer spectacle. But one member of the Starbase watching community, known as VIX, did something very simple, merely slowed the video down. And what was revealed made no small number of people watch it repeatedly, just to be certain they were not seeing things. The 6 engines did not ignite simultaneously. The 2 RVAC engines on the leeward side, that is, the side sheltered from the wind on the booster, together with the center sea level engine, ignited first. Only moments ahead of the remaining engines, measured in thousandths of a second, nearly imperceptible to the naked eye at normal playback speed. Sounds like it hardly warrants attention, doesn't it? Just a few thousandths of a second. But consider it this way. When 3 engines within a given spatial cluster fire ahead of the others, the total thrust at that instant is no longer symmetric about the booster's center. It produces a rotational force, a moment. And that moment, given the exact position of the early igniting engines, would push the top section of the booster to tilt toward a very specific direction, toward the tile side, that is, the face bearing the heat shield. This is not speculation. This is basic mechanics. 3 engines thrusting early produces an offset force. An offset force produces a rotational moment. That much is certain to occur, beyond dispute. The real question lies elsewhere. Is that moment large enough to influence the flip direction of an entire booster weighing hundreds of tons? And this is where the account becomes considerably more interesting. Cross-referencing against the Flight 12 mystery. Let us return to Flight 12. Following stage separation per the planned flight profile, the booster must execute a flip maneuver to orient the engine base toward the subsequent landing burn. The heat shield face must point inward. The opposite face must point outward toward space. But the onboard footage data from Flight 12 itself shows the reverse. The booster flipped in the wrong direction. The tile face ended up pointing outward into space rather than inward as planned. This is an anomaly the Starbase watching community had noticed for a long time. Yet for months, no mechanistic explanation was ever offered publicly, not from SpaceX, nor from any independent analyst sufficiently persuasive. Until this week. Placing the 2 facts side by side, Ship 40's asymmetric ignition sequence and Flight 12's incorrect flip direction, one finds they align in a striking manner. Flight 12's incorrect flip direction is precisely the direction that an asymmetric ignition cluster of the Ship 40 type would produce. This is not a trivial coincidence. This is a logical piece fitting exactly into a gap that had persisted for months. Degree of certainty and 3 alternative hypotheses. Now, I want to pause here for a moment because this is the most important portion, not for the sake of drama, but for the sake of honesty. The data source here is a slowed down edit produced by the community, not an official technical release from SpaceX. There is no accompanying telemetry data with which to precisely measure the delay in milliseconds, nor the true magnitude of the rotational moment. So rather than stating that SpaceX has confirmed this as the cause, which would be inaccurate, the more precise formulation is, this is a hypothesis with very strong observational grounding, an almost perfect directional match, but not yet a closed conclusion. That distinction matters, because a credible channel must distinguish between what it knows with certainty and what it is inferring on reasonable grounds. So, are there other possibilities that might explain this phenomenon? There are 3 possibilities commonly cited, and I want to go through each in turn so that you can see why the ignition hypothesis remains the strongest at present. The first possibility, upper atmosphere winds. But were it wind, the flip direction would depend on the atmospheric conditions of each individual flight, That is, it would carry a stochastic character. Whereas the asymmetric ignition sequence appears to be a recurring characteristic of the system, not something that appeared on a single occasion only. This renders the ignition hypothesis considerably firmer than a purely atmospheric hypothesis. The second possibility, a faulty sensor producing an incorrect display. But Flight 12's flipped direction was recorded through direct visual imagery from onboard footage, not merely through numerical data. So the possibility of this being a display error is almost entirely ruled out. The third possibility, and this is the hardest to refute, is that this may be a deliberate design decision. Staggered ignition is at times employed to reduce structural shock loading when multiple engines start up simultaneously, a technique not uncommon in the design of multi-chamber engine systems. If that is the case, the rotational moment is not a defect. It is an accepted side effect, bundled together with an otherwise entirely reasonable engineering decision. With the data currently available, we cannot conclusively determine whether this is intentional or something not yet fully brought under control. But regardless of which is true, the physical consequence for the booster's flip direction remains the same. Comparison with Falcon 9. There is one point of comparison that renders this detail all the more noteworthy. Falcon 9, with its 9 Merlin engines, likewise does not ignite in perfect simultaneity. There is a small delay between engines, measured in milliseconds. But according to what SpaceX has publicly disclosed over the years, the primary purpose of that delay is to reduce peak propellant flow through the pump system, to avert simultaneous hydraulic shock across the entire plumbing system, not to deliberately generate a rotational moment. If Starship's ignition sequence is serving a different purpose, or is instead a side effect not yet fully brought under control, this constitutes a notable point of divergence from the control logic already proven across hundreds of Falcon 9 launches. It also reveals something further. As the number of engines increases, as engine clusters are arranged in more complex configurations, leeward, windward, center, peripheral, the complexity of the control problem escalates considerably. This is an issue that Falcon 9, with its far more symmetrical configuration, confronts to a much lesser degree. In other words, Starship is playing a considerably harder game than Falcon 9 ever had to play. If you found this analysis worthwhile, now is an apt moment to hit like, and if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please do so as not to miss analyses of this kind each week. Now, back to the original question. If the ignition hypothesis is correct, what does it imply for Flight 13? To answer that, I must bring you to a separate incident, one that has just occurred on Booster 20 itself, the candidate for Flight 13. The Booster 20 Chopstick Actuator. During the process of lifting Booster 20 into position atop the Pad 2 launch stand, SpaceX's engineering team detected a problem. A right-side chopstick actuator malfunctioned. This is the mechanism assembly that governs the chopstick's motion, the component that will lift, hold, and later perform the booster catch during landing. In other words, this is one of the most critical mechanical assemblies within the entire reusability system. Rather than attempting an in-place repair at that height, the engineering team decided to remove the actuator assembly entirely. They disconnected the long piston running from the chopstick down to the base pivot point at both ends, lowered it to the ground. A replacement actuator had already been prepared in advance, brought out using a dedicated jig, connected to a crane, fitted into the correct position, test operated to verify its range of motion before being confirmed ready. This entire operation took place at night, a complete departure from the original plan, which had been scheduled for daytime. Once the new actuator was confirmed stable, the chopstick resumed operation and lifted the booster into its proper position. Notably, immediately thereafter, Booster 20 nonetheless carried out a successful static fire, but with an anomalous duration, estimated at roughly 20 to 25 seconds, considerably longer than prior test firings. Risk assessment. Now, the essential question, does this incident warrant concern? The honest answer is not sufficient to draw a conclusion, yet not sufficient to be fully reassured either. During the static lift and lower phase, the load the actuator must bear is chiefly pure gravitational load. The booster is suspended, moving slowly. This constitutes a relatively mild loading condition. But in an actual catch, the entire picture differs. The booster approaches carrying residual velocity following the landing burn. There may be small lateral oscillations, and that entire dynamic load must be absorbed within an extremely brief window of time as the chopstick arms close around the booster's catch points. This is dynamic loading, fundamentally different in nature from the static loading present during the lift. If an actuator assembly fails under a load condition considerably lighter than that of an actual catch, this does not necessarily mean it will fail during the catch itself, but it does suggest that this assembly safety margin may be narrower than anticipated. And should SpaceX merely replace the hardware without identifying the failure's root cause, the same risk could readily recur, precisely at the most critical juncture of all, the moment of the Flight 13 catch. As for the anomalous static fire duration, lasting 20 to 25 seconds, this may not be simply an ordinary engine test. It is quite plausible that this also served as a means of verifying whether the new actuator assembly, together with the entire Chopstick system, could remain stable under the real-world vibration produced by 6 engines operating at full thrust over an extended duration before SpaceX places its confidence in it for the catch mission. This is an inference drawn from the anomalous duration, not to something SpaceX has publicly confirmed as the test's actual purpose. Comparing landing architectures, Falcon 9 versus Starship. There is one further comparison worth pondering. Falcon 9 lands by means of landing legs, affixed directly and permanently to the booster itself, independent of any ground-based mechanism whatsoever. Advantage: a self-contained system proven across hundreds of successful landings. Disadvantage: the landing legs constitute dead weight that must be carried throughout the entirety of the flight. This costs fuel, and it necessitates maintenance following each landing. Starship's Chopstick pursues an entirely opposite approach. It eliminates landing leg mass from the booster, rendering it lighter and capable of carrying greater payload. But in exchange, the entire responsibility for absorbing dynamic landing loads is transferred to the ground-based system, precisely the actuator assembly that malfunctioned this past week. This is not evidence that the Chopstick constitutes a flawed concept. It has already demonstrated its effectiveness through prior successful catches. But this incident stands as a very concrete demonstration. Engineering trade-offs never vanish. They merely relocate from one point to another. The mechanical risk no longer resides upon the booster, it now resides on the ground. And a failure occurring precisely at the moment of catch carries consequences that arrive more swiftly and are considerably harder to recover from than a landing leg suffering a minor malfunction. Conclusion: is Flight 13 genuinely at risk? So, placing these two facts side by side, the asymmetric ignition sequence and the actuator failure, what did they indicate regarding Flight 13? These two risks act upon two entirely distinct phases of the flight. The ignition-related risk operates during the stage separation phase, while the booster remains at high altitude. The flight control system possesses more time and more data with which to compensate for directional deviation. According to what has been publicly documented, Flight 12 exhibited no sign of losing control immediately following its incorrect flip. This indicates the system possesses a certain degree of tolerance for this type of deviation, but that tolerance is not unlimited. The actuator-related risk, conversely, operates at the flight's final and most sensitive phase, the moment of catch, where the permissible margin for error is considerably smaller, and a mechanical failure occurring precisely at that moment leaves almost no safe fallback option for either the booster or the ground infrastructure. Were one required to rank which merits closer monitoring at present, the actuator risk is the more salient concern in the short term, simply because it bears directly upon the very hardware assembly that was just hastily replaced, and which has never been verified under genuine dynamic loading conditions. As for the ignition-related risk, if it is indeed the cause, it appears to be a characteristic that has persisted across at least 2 observed instances without having yet produced a serious consequence. This suggests it currently falls within the existing safety margin, though it ought not be disregarded over the longer term. According to SpaceX's official announcement, the present launch date stands no earlier than July 16th. Should no further data regarding the root cause of the actuator failure be released prior to that date, the fullest answer to the question of whether Flight 13 is genuinely safe will arrive only when we witness, with our own eyes, this flight's own catch moment. That constitutes the complete data and analysis for this week concerning Ship 40 and Booster 20. Thank you for watching in full. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the Space Brief. Several further videos await you right on the end screen.